In this video, I would like to talk about cognitive biases. So cognitive biases are systematic errors in thinking that arise from faulty information processing and interpretation. These biases can compromise the decision making, the assessment, the estimation of various aspects of your project. So it's important to be aware of them and also take the measures in order to respond to them and to try to mitigate them or eliminate them as much as possible. So there are 24 cognitive biases that we're going to be discussing. We have anchoring, we have the sunken cost fallacy, the availability heuristic, the curse of knowledge, confirmation bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect, the belief bias, the self-serving bias, the backfire bias, the backfire effect, the Burnham effect, the groupthink, the negativity bias, the declinism, and the framing effect, and the fundamental attribution error, and the halo effect, and the optimism bias, the pessimism bias, the just world hypothesis, the in-group bias, the placebo effect, the bystander effect, the reactance, and the spotlight effect. So we're going to be explaining all of these biases, and then we're going to talk about certain measurements that we can take in order to minimize these biases. So first of all, we have anchoring, which is where the subsequent judgments are highly influenced by your initial judgment. So because humans are associative by nature, and anchoring is a result of misusing the cognitive association. So due to our sense of association, the first time we experience something, we tend to say that's the standard way of in which this thing operates. So for example, the first subcontractor that you worked with in a certain industry was great, so therefore you think that the rest will be great as well. So that's an example of anchoring, where the first impressions highly influence your subsequent judgments. So that's something to be wary of. Of course, first impressions do have value and do have merit, but it's also important to know how much weight they actually have, not to give them excessive weight. So that's anchoring. Then you have the sunk cost fallacy, where you which is about irrationally clinging to things that have already cost something. So for example, that you have a project that already cost us $5 million, so we might as well finish it. That's the sunken cost fallacy. The sunken cost fallacy, because you're not looking whether the project is still worth doing or not. You're looking at how much you invested in the project in order to continue it. So instead of that way of thinking, you would like to ask, is the project still in line with the organization's strategic objectives? That's the thought that you should have in mind, rather than the sunk cost fallacy. So that's also important to consider. So whenever you're deciding whether you should continue or take on the project, you don't want to look at the sunk cost. You actually want to look at whether the project is still in alignment with your organization's strategic objectives. So that's something to consider. And you have the availability heuristic, which is judgments are influenced by what springs most easily to mind. So here, for example, you have Jack is very competent, but in his first 6 months he made a mistake, and that was costly to the organization in the example here. So that's why his manager thinks he doesn't deserve a promotion. This is an example of a heuristic bias, because while Jack is very competent, the thing that springs to the mind of his manager is that he made the mistake that he made. So that's similar to anchoring, but here the association is based on emotion rather than exposure. So here it's what you give more value to things that come up to mind. Like whenever you read the news, you see that lots of you listen to lots of accidents and accidents. So you think that the world has more problems than it actually does. So that's also an example of the availability heuristic. So that's also something to be wary of. And then you have the curse of knowledge, where once understanding something, one presumes it to be obvious to other people, to everybody else. So for example, here the IT specialist says that the C++ is an easy programming language. So why is the other person not able to follow the instruction? Here the other person says that they don't have experience nor training in the IT field. So here the bias here is that the IT person thinks that since they understand something, it must mean it's easy to everybody else. So that's an example of the curse of knowledge. They forgot that the amount of effort that was needed to be put into it, or they forgot the perspective that of their upbringing or their background that actually enabled the knowledge to be gained. So that's an example of a problem of the curse of knowledge. And then you have the confirmation bias, where favoring things that confirm existing beliefs. So whenever you want to argue with another person, if you only look at the articles that actually support your argument, then that's an example of confirmation bias, in which you just try to reinforce your existing thoughts and beliefs, and disregarding non-favoring sources of information. So this is also something to be wary of, and also be consider. So here you want to look at various perspectives and multiple viewpoints in order to make sure that you get the correct belief and the correct view, in order to make sure, of course, that you don't make wrong decisions throughout your projects. So that's something to consider in regards to confirmation bias. Of course, when you want to you want to look at your sources, you want to make sure that their objectives are reliable and trustworthy, which is actually a more complicated which is more complicated and easily said than done. But however, that's an effort that we should actually proactively work towards. And then we have the Dunning-Kruger effect, where one's confidence in a topic is not always proportional to their competence. So as you see here in the graph, as somebody enters a topic, their confidence is basically non-existent, because they don't know anything about the topic. Then as they learn, they actually increase their confidence to a peak, which is casually referred to as the peak of Mount Stupidity, in which they think the topic is very easy, and there is no difficulty or anything about it. Then as they experience, they face their first struggle, they enter the valley of despair, where their confidence gets a nosedive, in which they think that they're not good at it, even though they're in fact, due to their increased experience, they're better than they were initially. And then after a while, after they experience it further, they enter the slope of enlightenment, in which they're getting the hang of this, and then the plateau of sustainability, in which they can handle this. So the two takeaway from here is that there is a fluctuating relationship between competence and confidence. So there is a fluctuating relationship, and that's the first takeaway. And the second takeaway is that confidence is not a perfect indicator of competence. So whenever you're discussing your work with, discussing a task or work with your team members, maybe the loudest and most confident person in the room might not be necessarily the most competent, whose opinion is most competent. So that's also something you want to consider and be careful of. The person that with the highest amount of confidence may actually be simply at the initial stage of their competence, where or has not faced as many struggles as the other person who is whose confidence is a little bit less shaken. So that's a scenario. So maybe the first person that's very confident didn't face many complex situations as the other person who has faced lots of struggles, and therefore is more conservative in their opinions, or more reserved in their views, whereas the first one that's highly confident simply faced lots of simple situations. Therefore their confidence is actually very high because they didn't struggle as much. So that's also a factor to consider. So not the confidence is not a perfect indicator of competence. There is a relationship, but it's also it's a more complicated relationship than we might think. And then we have the belief bias, which is over-relying on pre-existing beliefs and knowledge when evaluating the conclusions of an argument. So here, for example, you receive a report of findings that conflict with your own findings, therefore you reject it. That's not how you should go on about your issues. Instead, you want to understand how the person that prepared the documents achieved the findings that conflict with your own. So that's how you should go on about it. You should not just reject something immediately because it conflicts with a pre-existing belief. You should actually analyze and look at what happened and try to understand the process in which the findings or the arguments or the conclusions came about. So you want to understand the processes rather than reject them under the premise that they conflict with your pre-existing beliefs. You want to see the logic that led to that conclusion. Maybe you're still right. Maybe actually the other person has merit, and maybe it's a mix of the two. So that's something worth considering. And then you have the self-serving bias, which is believing that one is responsible for their achievements, while external factors are responsible for their failures. So here the logic of half of the people like me because I'm awesome, and the other half does not like me because they are jealous. So that's an example of a self-serving bias, in which you think that good things happen due to your own efforts and merits, whereas bad things happen due to bad luck or external factors or a conspiracy or something like that. So that's an example of a self-serving bias. And then you have the backfire effect, where tending to resist evidence that conflicts with one's beliefs. So here, even if you have evidence that the other person is wrong about something, showing them that evidence in a way that's not appropriate might actually cause them to react in a more more defensive manner. So it's not just about whether you're right or wrong. It's all on the strength of the evidence. It's also about the attitude of the other person and how open they are to the evidence, and also that's also something you want to be tactful, and you want to be careful in how you present information that conflicts with another person's belief. So for example, the blue person here says that their sources say that A did B, but the yellow person says that they saw A do C instead of B, and but that conflicts with the blue person's belief. So the blue person says that the yellow person is blind. So that's an example of the backfire effect, in which the person will go through leaps to protect their beliefs. So that's something you want to also consider in yourself, as well as consider in others, so that you know how to present the information and have the importance to and also acknowledge it in yourself, in order to try to minimize this kind of behavior and this way of thinking as well, in order to be more open to rational and logical arguments and reasonable arguments. So that's also something to consider. And then you have the Burnham effect, which is tending to see the information provided about one's trait is about them regardless of the information generalization. So here if one tells you it is amazing how you overcame hardships that you have experienced, and that you are so smart and capable, and you think that that's about you, that's being said about you, then you have fallen to the Burnham effect, where it's specifically it's a more they present information in a generalized way, yet it resonates with you in such a way that you can relate to it. So that's the Burnham effect, and horoscopes tend to rely on the Burnham effect to convince readers that it relates to them. So that's also something to consider. And then you have the groupthink, which is letting the social dynamics of a group situation override the best outcomes. So here you follow what the group says. It's like a mob rule mentality, where you follow what the group says regardless of whether they are correct or not. So a way of dealing with that is, rather than openly contradicting others, seek to facilitate objective means of evaluation and critical thinking practice as a group activity. So you use group activities in order to facilitate critical thinking, rather than just follow the loud voices in the group and follow the group. That's also the groupthink mentality might fall prey to the Dunning-Kruger effect, in which the confident voices might sound the most persuasive, even though they actually might be the least knowledgeable on the topic. So that's also something to be aware of. So again, try to analyze information in an objective manner and critically. And then you have the negative bias, where giving more weightage to the negatives over the positives, and allowing the negatives to disproportionately influence one's thinking. We heard like things like one insult is worth like 10 praises. So that's an example of the negativity bias, in which the negative, even if the value or the quantity of the negatives is much less than the positives, we tend to give more we tend to perceive the negatives more often than the positives, which will actually increase our perceptive value of the negative. So that's a form of bias that we need to account for and be aware of, and try to mitigate or minimize or avoid. So that's also a form of bias that we want to consider. And then there is the declinism, where remembering the past to be better than it was and expecting the future to be worse than it will likely be. So here you put on the nostalgic goggles and you follow the grass is greener on the other side mentality in terms of in terms of timeline, in which the past was better than the present and the present will probably be better than the future. So that's a form of pessimism. But so here, instead of relying on nostalgic impressions of how great things used to be, use measurable matrices to give you an objective assessment. So look over how, for example, you're put in the appropriate KPIs, the key performance indicators, the earned value. Use earned value assessments to see whether our performance is actually indeed deteriorating or not. And use proper forecasting methods to actually see whether your project is actually doing better or not. So that's also something you want to consider. And then you have the framing effect, where decision making is influenced by how information is presented. So for example, here we're selling the yogurt, and here the way the yogurt was framed affected the profits. So even though they're basically the same product, the 20% fat and the 80% fat free, the way it's presented, the way it's framed, that made the difference, that increased the appeal, that increased the sale. So that's why during project management it's important that the framing effect, you should be aware of it. It's not just about the way that it's presented. You want to look at the merits. Is there actually really a difference, or is it just the way it's presented? So try not to be fooled by the framing effect or manipulated by the framing effect. And then you have the fundamental attribute error, where emphasizing internal explanations over considering circumstances when making judgments. So here, for example, the yellow person was late, so the blue person says, "You are late, therefore I deem you to be irresponsible," when in actuality the yellow person says that the traffic was unforeseeably congested today, so that's why they're late. So here, instead of looking over judging a person or an individual saying and deeming them to be certain characteristics over a one-time interaction, you would also like to look at the circumstances in which that interaction took place. That resulted in said interaction. So you want to avoid being too quick to judge. So that's also something you want to avoid. So try to be careful and don't be too quick to judge whenever it's possible. For you, whenever you're not in a hurry to judge anybody, try to not judge anybody. And then you have the halo effect, where it's the tendency for an impression created in one area to influence opinion in another. So in project management, it is the tendency to promote people to managerial position because of their functional expertise. So here, for example, you have a great engineer and thinking that they will be a great manager. So while a great engineer is indeed carries great merit, It's also worth considering that it doesn't necessarily make a great project manager, because a great engineer has a more functional or technical field, technical expertise, whereas managerial skills that require a more people skills and technical managerial skills, if you will. So that's an important distinction. And that's why it's important to avoid the halo effect, because even though one might be great in one field, that doesn't mean they'll be great in another. Everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses, and that's something we need to be mindful of. And then we have the optimism bias, which is overestimating the likelihood of good things happening, so thinking that all opportunities will be captured. And you have the pessimism bias, which is overestimating the likelihood of bad things happening. So the thought of no threat will be avoided. Both of these are things we should be careful of. And however, in project management, we're actually going to consider for example, optimistic estimates and pessimistic estimates as factors, but we're not gonna treat them as the end all be all factors in our estimates and our analysis. So that's also an important thing to consider. So the optimistic and pessimistic bias, pessimism bias, putting a stronger value in whether good things and bad things are going to happen. So here we want to minimize our overestimation. We want to, or rather, we would like to make sure our estimates are balanced. So we want to consider both the optimistic and then pessimistic and the most likely scenarios, how they're going to happen. And that's why it's important to have a more systematic thought process in which, while the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios are accounted for, they're not going to be overestimated. And then we have the just world hypothesis, where you believe that the world operates in accordance to one's ideas of justice and fairness. So this mentality is the right makes might mentality, where the good will prosper and the bad will perish. This way of thinking that good things will happen to good people and bad things will happen to bad people according to the laws of the universe, of the world. So in this life, whether good things will happen or not. This, in the most extreme implementation of this bias, this could lead to victim blaming, because with the mentality of good things happening to good people and bad things happening to bad people, then the victim here, bad things happen to them. That's why but with the logic of good things happening to good people and bad things happening to bad people, that will lead to extreme cases of victim blaming. So it's important to make a distinction between the logical flow of the logical flow of things and the logical flow of the world, and between what's ethical and what's moral. There is a distinction between the two, and that's important for us to make the distinction. Of course, we would like to, most of us would like to work towards a world where the good prosper and the bad people are either the bad are either reformed or punished, but we need to also make a distinction between how the world actually operates and how and the morality or ethics of the situation and scenarios. So that's also something to consider. And then you have the in-group bias, where tending to give preferential treatment to others who belong to the same group that you do. So here, if somebody told you that a team member of yours made a mistake, and you go defensive for them and say my team members don't do no wrong, then you might have an in-group bias. So here, of course, you want to actually try to have a more objective reasoning and objective logical thinking. So that's also something you want to consider and be mindful of. And then you have the placebo effect, in which an effect produced by a placebo drug or treatment, which cannot be attributed to the properties of the placebo itself and must therefore be due to the patient's belief in that treatment. So that's something that is less applicable to less likely to be applicable to project management, but nevertheless, it's the effects that due to you thinking it has an effect, an object or a product having an effect, rather than the object or the product actually having an inherent effect on you the way you're told to. So that's a placebo effect. And then the bystander effect, where you're presuming that someone else will take care of an issue in case of an emergency. So here you say in case of a fire, for example, you say that safety should take care of this, and you have nothing to do here. No, that's the bystander effect. Of course, as a project manager, you should be proactive, coordinative, and initiative when dealing with safety, quality, and risk concerns in your project. So that's important thing to consider, and you should not fall victim to the bystander effect. You should actually be proactive and initiative in solving problems as you go on throughout your project. And then you have the reactance, when one is inclined to do the opposite of what others are telling them to do. So if you're told to do A and you instead, out of spite, you want to do B instead, then that's a reactance bias, or basically you do things out of a desire of non-conformance. You should also be wary of that. So you don't do things to you as a project manager. You want to do what's needed to achieve the project objectives, and make sure that the project objectives are in line with the organization strategy, of course under ethical ways. So you don't want to fall victim to either conformance or non-conformance. So that's also why you want to be aware of reactance bias, if that will affect you. And then finally, you have the spotlight effect, where tending to overestimate how much others notice about you. So if you have stage fright, you might think that everybody will notice your flaws and mistakes, but where in fact other people will be way more concerned about their own issues, their own interest, or their own matters. So that's also something you want to consider. Don't overestimate how much people are focusing on you. That's both in a positive and negative manner, either that they're not gonna be noticing your flaws or mistakes, and also not that they're gonna focus that they're not gonna focus on how awesome and amazing you are. So that's also something you want to consider, the spotlight effect. Don't worry too much about it, and try to focus more on getting the job done. Making sure that you get your job done, and doing it in a effective manner that brings the intended results. So that's what your job as a project manager. So in the end, how to deal with cognitive biases. First of all, you want to increase your self-awareness and acknowledge your own biases. So admitting that there is a problem is the first step to solving it, and try to gather information from multiple relevant viewpoints, which is pretty tricky because what are the relevant viewpoints. Of course, and during the project, you want the viewpoints of subject matter experts and your team members and the relevant stakeholders like sponsors, and the customers. So all of these are viewpoints that you want to gather, and be especially tactful towards individuals that are expressing biases. So use your people skills, use the appropriate skills in order to deal with them. You don't just tell them that they're wrong. No, you actually want to actually try to instead try to facilitate their their thinking in order to direct it to a more constructive manner, rather than leave them stick to their biases, or having their biases remain the way they are. You want to help them through tactful means, through influential, persuasive means, to guide their thought process in order to eliminate or at least minimize their biases. And also analyze information objectively and not maliciously. So your objective is to solve a problem and to achieve the project success. So you don't want to analyze the information just for the sake of ripping it apart, or finding what's wrong with it, or simply finding what's wrong with it. You also want to see whether it actually holds value to your project, whether it's relevant to you or not. So you want to think in an objective manner, in a critical manner, in an appropriate manner. So, and finally, develop a systematic approach to problem solving by defining the problem, identifying the root causes through conducting a root cause analysis, generating possible solutions through gathering additional information, critical thinking, and having quantitative and or logical approaches, and choosing the best solution through alternative analysis, and implementing the solution and verifying the solution effectiveness. So that's also a way to solve your problems and to minimize the bias through having a systematic approach to problem solving.